In 2008, I began researching and writing about a community nestled in the center of Alabama called Gee's Bend. There lived a group of black tenant farmers who were devastated when the white merchant who was lending them their agricultural supplies passed away. All at once, and in a very violent way, the merchant's family collected from the farmers what was rightfully theirs, every tool, every seed, and every machine in the community that the community was using to grow their food. The community was pillaged. Also in 2008, Doug Blackmon, then the Wall Street Journal's Atlanta bureau chief, had just come out with a new book, Slavery by Another Name. And he was touring the country to speak about his work. Doug visited Birmingham Public Library, where I was working at the time in the archives. I listened to Doug speak about tenant farming, sharecropping, and other forms of forced labor. He doesn't know this, but Doug's work encouraged me to continue mine, and to call what I was writing by its true name, slavery. Now for the spoiler. One of us went on to complete our research and wrote a very nice article about Gee's Bend, and one of us won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. I'll let you figure out who's who. So I just want to thank personally Doug Blackmon for his inspiration to me, and I ask all of you to welcome him here tonight to talk about it.
Well, thank you. Gee's Bend is one of the most interesting places in our country, and the story, the time capsule of American oppression, but also culture and history. Really remarkable place. Have you guys heard of it, Gee's Bend? There was a Pulitzer Prize associated with it. There was a guy at the LA Times who wrote a piece about Gee's Bend when the ferry service was terminated, but it's actually in the bend of is it the Alabama River? What is? Yeah, so but it's an African American community that has existed since back to times of slavery. Exactly, the Gee's Bend quilts. That's the most identifiable thing that's come out of that. Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, really remarkable place, and one of those kind of the sorts of places that the sort of time capsule locations that historians or historically oriented people are really lucky to discover, and by virtue of the people who were there, and sometimes the documents that survive in places where there hasn't been a reason to throw away everything, that things survive, and there were a lot of those in Alabama that helped me out. But thank you, thanks for the kind introduction, and I'm glad to know that in some small way I helped in those ways. The Birmingham Archive, by the way, it was a terrific, particularly for a southern city, I think, an amazingly live and serious archive. I joke about, there's a story I tell that we probably don't have time for tonight, but the book that a film project of mine that I'm working on now that'll come out on PBS in about a year, arguably began with an essay that I wrote in the 7th grade in 1977. And so it's a project I've been working on now for in excess of 40 years. So I do have a problem with things that I hang on to, that I obsess on. But it began with an essay that I wrote to submit in a contest sponsored by the Historical Society of Washington County, Mississippi. And I always joke that that's, AKA the little old white ladies Confederate fetishist group of Washington County, Mississippi, where I grew up. But most historical societies do, wherever they are, have some version of that tinge to them, and local archives tend to reflect that. But the Birmingham archives were really I did a lot of work there, and a great place. But we're not here to talk exactly about all that. But thank you all for coming out on a dreadful evening. I'm glad that I made it. Glad you made it. I came in from Atlanta just this afternoon. So. But also commendations to the organizers just for the topic of this series. It's sort of astonishing that there's still anything to say about a constitutional amendment that was adopted in December of 1865. That there's, and it's just a handful of words, 2 or 3 sentences long. It's sort of amazing that there's anything to discuss about what it meant or the interpretations of its meaning. But that's the case in the world that we live in now. And in some respects, it's probably more relevant now than it has been in 100 years. Exactly what the 13th Amendment means. I'm a little torn, I have to confess, between. I find that even though the Slavery by Another Name, the book took over my life now 10 years ago, or really more than that, before it was finished, because I worked on the book for 7 years, I guess, before it came out. And so almost 20 years ago, it began encroaching, and before it fully took over my entire existence. And I'm trying to not let it continue to completely control me, but it's amazing to me that we then made it into a film. This doesn't mean what it once meant because the publishing technology has changed, where a printing of a book today can be a very small number of printings, of actual copies. But it's in something like its 30th or 40th printing. And so it's reached all these people. It was on the New York Times bestseller list as in hardback and on paperback, made it into a film. It's become one of the most repeat broadcast films on PBS and public television. Every February, like this past February, the film aired more than 500 times in the month of February on various PBS stations around the country. And so you can do something like this that is just sort of a dream. When I was working on it, I lived in just constant anxiety that the story is so grim and it's so dense, and is anybody going to have any care about this? Is anybody other than my mother going to read it? So a class sort of graduate students, terror, that, and usually fulfilled for most graduate students, that nobody but their mother reads their monumental work. And so, but this one though, it turns out it's had this sort of, a writer's dream of what could happen to it, and yet it's still the case that everywhere I go, anytime I start talking about it, I encounter all sorts of people like tonight, who are like, wow, I had no idea, And so the fundamental story of the book, of this notion that slavery didn't really end at the end of the Civil War and persisted for deep into the 20th century, into the period of the lives of there may be a few people in the room who date back to just before World War II, but that it actually reached into the world, the world that we are a part of, is still a pretty astonishing idea. And so I'm a little torn. Do I want to talk about that, or do I talk about really the topic, that being the 13th Amendment? But I'll start on the 13th Amendment, because there are some things that I wrote about in the book that I was fascinated by, and that I didn't really understand until I got into them. But there really are more about the history of the amendment that I think are worth being reminded of. This baseline thing, though, that a decade ago, 10 years ago when this book came out, 10 and a half, I guess now, to just the title, Slavery by Another Name, just the premise that Abraham Lincoln didn't actually succeed at fully eradicating slavery, that he interrupted slavery, and that the Civil War caused a transformation of slavery. But the idea to assert and try to prove, even 10 years ago, that slavery really didn't end at the end of the Civil War, and that it did extend well into the 20th century, and that form of involuntary servitude that continued was a basal element of this much larger regime of American apartheid, which we don't call it that, but we really should. That's really we gravitate toward old labels like Jim Crow and such, but really we're just talking about American apartheid. But this idea that I was premising 10 years ago was really quite radical then. It was more radical even than I fully realized, though I knew it was pretty radical. And it's amazing to me now that it's 10 years later, and particularly if I'm out speaking if I'm at a university somewhere talking to a very young audience, and I say something like, well, it turns, Civil War didn't really end slavery continued long past it. They all go, yeah, of course, yeah, right, we all know that, And so just this amazing sort of change in terms of that, so I have to stop and say to them, hey, no, but wait a minute, that was really radical when I said it 10 years ago, hang on. But it was this radical notion then, and it was particularly radical or kind of. It was a bolt out of the sky for me when I first comprehended it. This thing now that gets talked about so much, and that is that the 13th Amendment has this exception in the middle of it. It has this clause in the middle of the first part of the amendment. So it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, and you know where that's going. Is going to get to exist anymore. But in the middle it says except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Duly convicted being the critical variable there, and that was a shock to me when I first started into the project that became Slavery by Another Name. It began with a story that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal. I spent most of my career as a journalist at the Journal, and a good bit of that time asked the Atlanta bureau chief and as a manager of a lot of other reporters. But I continued to write, and I always wrote a good bit about race, and I was always interested in the question of race and corporate conduct, which is something that, particularly historically, which is something that's not written about very much, and that the Civil Rights Movement didn't address in any particularly upfront sort of way. The Civil Rights Movement was really about the state and forcing the state to cease requiring injuries to black people. That's really what the movement was all about. And the idea that, and by the way, we also need to address that private corporations have been engaged for decades and decades in all sorts of nefarious and injurious practices toward black people but that are not illegal because it's not illegal for private parties to have done those things. That just really wasn't on the radar screen of the discussion. In fact, it probably seemed pretty trivial to the big, broad issues that the movement were about. But I got very interested in this idea of that really it's business that and the exchange of money, really, the old line, follow the money. But it really is that this notion that so much of the laws that we follow most frequently and that we pay the most attention to are actually enforced by commercial interests, not really by the government. We pay our taxes and we obey the tax code not because an IRS agent comes by and tells us to all the time, or is waiting with a ticket book out in the front yard to ticket us for breaking tax laws. We do it because our accountants tell us to, or our bankers tell us to, and it's real estate agents and it was bankers who enforced the practices and the laws that said you don't loan money to black people buying houses in certain neighborhoods. And it was business people and commercial interests that enforced the dimensions of segregation that were most harmful to African Americans, other than being deprived of the vote. And so I was always sort of interested in this idea that this sort of unexamined dimension of the American story and the role of commerce and all of that. And that was a natural thing to write about at the Wall Street Journal. And so I ended up writing a series of stories in the late 1990s that related to that theme, the role of commerce and race. And then that led me, in the course of that, to this one story about this one place in Alabama that I originally thought was going to be just a story about that place. That here was this place in Alabama where there were big, huge coal mines at the beginning of the 20th century, owned by U.S. Steel Corporation, the most iconic American corporation there is. You can't get any more iconic than having United States in your name. And the original modern corporation. The folks in Pennsylvania have a better awareness of this probably, but most people don't. That U.S. Steel is really it's the creation of U.S. Steel in 1901 that is the invention of the modern corporation as it exists today. And it was for decades the largest corporation in the world, the most visible corporation in the world, certainly the most visible American corporation through all of its heyday. And it ends up acquiring this vast enterprise in the South in 1907 in what was the largest financial transaction that had ever occurred in American history at that time. And so it ends up as the owner of this complex of coal mines where there are thousands of people being forced to labor, apparently, from the first look at it, as enslaved people, but ostensibly as prisoners, working there as punishment for a crime. And so I started digging into that and initially imagined that was the story I was going to write, about this place in Alabama and this iconic American corporation and the things that had happened there. And the story that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in 2001 to some degree was that, though I had already begun to realize that there was a much bigger phenomenon that that the story of U.S. Steel in Birmingham and the environs of Birmingham represented, but I still didn't realize quite the scale of it. And it hadn't really dawned on me yet that there had been this question, an actual question of whether it was illegal to continue to enslave people. But there actually was a question that had existed into the 20th century because of this exception in the amendment, and also because of the desires of certain people to interpret that exception in a way that that would be advantageous to them. And so I had the same, after I wrote the original story and then ended up actually reluctantly being talked into writing the book. I was very opposed to writing the book originally. Thank God I didn't listen to myself. But once I began to work on it and to try to understand how could it be that it wasn't just this sort of classic story, and we, in a society like ours, in a successful society, an optimistic society like America's is, we gravitate to, and we really want badly for the mistakes of our society. We need them to be anomalies. We need them to be things that aren't representative of the larger society, but these mistakes where somebody turned off the road. And so I approached this initially with the idea that that's probably what this was. That okay, this was this anomaly. That where slavery was ended, and there were still a lot of bad things happening to African Americans. But here was this one case, or maybe there'll be a few other cases too, but of where people exploited a loophole or exploited the particular attitudes of a particular place. And that there was this anomalous, terrible thing, but as an anomaly, it wouldn't really challenge one's fundamental view of the society that we're a part of. But as I began to look at it more closely, I realized, well, it's not just this one company; it's all these other companies, and it went on for 50 or 60 or 70 years, and it involved thousands and thousands of people. And there was all this competition, and look who they were doing business with, and look, there was just as much of it in Georgia next door, and look, there was just as much of it in Florida. And I began to realize that okay, this wasn't an anomaly. This really was the system. This was the predominant system, and that it was in fact rooted in this strange exception in the 13th Amendment. And then I finally, deep into the process, I realized that in the first few years of the 20th century, that there had actually been some trials. Some people had been arrested and indicted for enslaving people. That sort of prominent, wealthy white people in Alabama and Georgia and Florida had been arrested and indicted for engaging in slavery in the first years of the 20th century. That by itself was sort of a revelation to me. How could that be? That 50 years after the Civil War, and so then I started digging into those court cases, and amazingly, it turned out there was a lot of record of those cases, and and then I finally come upon this point where in 1903. Where you have a group of very prominent Alabama citizens, though there were the same summer in 1903, there were a series of trials in Georgia, very similar trials, that involved even more prominent people. Really, in Georgia, the absolute, the most powerful elite, most wealthy citizens of Georgia, most dominant white figures in the state, a large number of them ended up on trial, charged with not enslavement, but with peonage. And peonage, if you're familiar with that at all, you're familiar with from movies and such references to Mexican peons. So that's the word Mexican peon. And if you haven't ever looked up what peon means, or you don't have some reason really to know, then what you will have absorbed is that just means some really poor person with nothing. That's a peon, and that's what we've sort of come to. It's almost a synonym for that. A incredibly poor, insignificant person, probably desperate person. But it actually is the real meaning of a peon is serf, is closer to serf, and it's part of the Mexican system of peonage, which really was a sort of serfdom, a Mexican slavery of a sort, but where you had people of Hispanic heritage, but who were attached to land and were sold with the land when the land was sold. So it was part of the old system of Mexican peonage. And so after the Civil War, coincidentally, having nothing to do with the end of slavery, but it so happened that it was in 1867 that after the United States acquired what is now New Mexico by the disputable methods that the United States came to acquire what is now New Mexico, that the Congress, somebody had the wise idea that it should be made clear that the old Mexican system of peonage shouldn't continue within the United States. And so a law was passed in 1867 that made peonage illegal. And the structure of peonage is that once you become in debt to a landowner, that as long as you're in debt to the landowner, you're attached to the land. And so peons in a system of peonage were always told they were still in debt to the landowner, and that's how they were compelled to remain on the land that they worked on. So peonage became a crime, though it was that's a statute that was almost never prosecuted. There were just one or two times that the statute was ever invoked in the 19th century, and it was largely forgotten. But then you get to the beginning of the 20th century, 1903, and in the beginning I don't really understand why this has happened or how it's come to pass, but I realized that there were these trials in Alabama and other places where prominent white people had been put on trial for apparently enslaving people, or purchasing people, literally buying people and selling them to one another, human trafficking we would call it now, but then they had been indicted for these practices and put on trial in these very politically unpopular trials. They got a huge amount of attention in the South, but they were all charged with peonage, not slavery. And so I was trying to understand why that was, and then I did realize that it was because there was no statute that made slavery a crime. And so there's a chapter in the book that's titled "Slavery Was Not a Crime," and it wasn't. Slavery was not a crime. And if you're familiar with the constitutional amendment that this happens to be the one example of this that people are most likely to ring a bell in their minds. But when Prohibition was initiated through a constitutional amendment, there was the constitutional amendment that said alcoholic beverages can't be produced or sold in the United States anymore. That's what the amendment said. But then there was the Volstead Act. Some of you will just, you know that term, the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act was the enabling legislation passed by Congress that actually established the criminal statutes that, it's not just unconstitutional to have a bar, it's actually a crime, and here's what the penalty is, and here's what the different crimes are and what categories they go in. Well, there never was a Volstead Act for slavery, for the 13th Amendment. It was just unconstitutional, and it's kind of crazy to imagine now that that there was any doubt about that. There would be any confusion about what exactly the 13th Amendment meant. But there never was, for whatever reason, there never was that sort of enabling legislation. It's also the case that in the history of constitutional law, and no reason to veer out into that, but the way that we view the Constitution as Americans, the way that it's interpreted, the literal mechanisms of how constitutionality is established, and has been an evolving thing. None of these things were completely clear at the founding of the Republic or with the adoption of the Constitution. It's the Supreme Court, essentially over time and through significant rulings that some of you probably know better than I do, established these things and the accepted practices of how these things work. And so part of it was just that the necessity of an enabling act to make these sorts of things clear was not as obvious in 1865, because also, we're talking about the 13th Amendment, so we're only 3 past the Bill of Rights. This is still very early in the process of amending the Constitution. But so it turned out that in fact slavery was not a crime, and if you go a little further back, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, but if you go back to 1865 and you try to figure out how was the stage set in such a way that there would be confusion later about the 13th Amendment, and of course it's a little confusion is in a case like this is a little bit like a man who's misbehaved in his marriage and says he was confused about what the rules were, or vice versa. Nonetheless, but if you go back and try to understand this, then it turns out that, one, we don't know a lot about parts of the debate around the 13th Amendment. There is no record of the discussion that the Senate Judiciary Committee engaged in, and it's actually the Judiciary Committee that ultimately drafted the language that became the amendment. There is a record of the wider discussion in the Congress leading up to the approval. There was actually a struggle to some degree in the Congress in 1865 over whether the 13th Amendment should say much more. There was a proposal at one point that had language in it that effectively would have incorporated what becomes the 14th Amendment. So there was a discussion about that should this be the amendment that actually declares not just the end of slavery, but the full equality of all people born in America and regardless of color. And so there was a debate about what exactly this amendment should do, but in the end, as is almost always the case with political compromise, and in fact is a wise thing typically, the 13th Amendment ends up pulling back and essentially relies on language that came from, if you remember from your middle school and high school American history classes, from the Northwest Ordinance, is that right? 1789, but where there is the Missouri Compromise that establishes essentially the first successful effort to block the expansion of slavery into new territories of the United States. And so the language in the Northwest Ordinance that addresses the expansion of slavery, the 13th Amendment mirrors the exact language of the Northwest Ordinance. And so in the end, that's where the actual language came from. And the reason that it didn't become more precise than it was because it was in fact still the political hot potato is too much of a cliche to say, but that even in 1865, even after this conflict, of the American Civil War, and I try to remind people of this because the Civil War is the one war, the one part of American history that everybody, even a completely slumbrous 18-year-old freshman, knows that the Civil War occurred, has heard some reference to it, may well not have ever heard of World War I, and may have even missed World War II, but has vaguely heard of the Civil War, almost certainly, and yet we forget the significance of it. 600,000 Americans, at least 600,000 Americans were killed, and if you look back at the proportionality of that in comparison to the population of the country at the time, the scale of the loss of that many men, overwhelmingly men, in that period of time, is just unbelievable. It's the equivalent of if the wildfires in California right now went to an exponentially greater level of disaster, and the wildfires raced through all of San Francisco and wiped out everything and killed every person in San Francisco, and the wildfires raced across most of Los Angeles and killed millions of people in Los Angeles. That's the scale of the loss that the country saw during the Civil War. In Pennsylvania, as it happens, I think Pennsylvania and Ohio were the two highest casualty states in the Civil War, but more, and it may be that Pennsylvania was number one, but certainly was in the top tier of where you had the Irish in New York were resisting being a part of it to the bitter end, but in Pennsylvania, the farm boys of Pennsylvania were the backbone of the Union effort, and so you've just had this incredible conflict that is also an example of that. The slavery, forms of enslavement have ended many times over the course of human history. Slavery has been over the course of all of human history, slavery has been you would have to say an almost permanent, perpetual element of human existence. And through almost all of that time, except for just the tiny little blip of time that we live in right now, it's been an endorsed and accepted and fundamental part of the way that human beings have behaved through all of time. But there have been many instances of emancipation and the end of a system of enslavement. The one that we in the West talk the most about, other than in the United States, of course, is the Israelites and their escape from Egypt. But there are all many stories of the end of slavery in particular societies. But the American Civil War is the only instance, I believe, it's the only instance, not just in regard to slavery, but it's the only instance that I think you can identify where a society made up of people who look the same and speak the same language for the most part, and are very culturally identifiable to one another, as Americans were in the 1860s, white Americans were in the 1860s. I believe it's the only instance in human history where you have a civil war on the scale where a society ends up waging war on itself over an idea, over an abstract principle, over a disagreement, not over an invasion of, not over someone seizing the throne and forces dividing against one another, and of course, in the Civil War was not nearly as pristine as that makes it sound. There were lots of cynical elements at work, but it was all about slavery. Wholly. That was absolutely what the American Civil War was about. But this idea, though, that this extraordinary event could occur in which so much grief and damage and horror has been associated with it, and that the moral outcome is achieved, and that it is so historic an outcome, and that one could then still, within just a few months, of the end of the war, that there's equivocation about exactly what did it mean, or exactly how firmly do we insist on what it means. And of course, what that was about was that the white Americans in the North and the South, even in 1865 and for decades and decades after that, were still sort of unsure about all this. A certainty had emerged among a lot of people in the North that slavery was a bad thing and that slavery shouldn't continue, but the idea that the notions incorporated into the 14th and 15th Amendment, that those should become the law of America, the idea that black people are in fact the same thing as white people in every regard, and entitled to all of the same rights and privileges and capacities in our society. That was still something that very few white people in America really believed that at the end of the Civil War. And the number of people, to the degree that people in the North did believe that, mostly rooted in religious and moral thinking of the time, that diminished dramatically over the next 50 years. So that by the time you get to 50 years out from the Civil War, there's a real consensus among white Americans all across the country, in every region of the country, essentially that citizenship for African Americans has been a mistake. And that there was a consensus that ending slavery was the right thing to have done, and in the North there was a strong view in 1900 or thereabouts that African Americans shouldn't be actively injured in the way that they were continued to be actively injured in the South. And there was a sensibility among some people, particularly in the Northeast, that really exceptional African Americans shouldn't be obstructed from some success in life. And so the Frederick Douglasses of the world should be able to achieve, and the W.E.B. Du Boises ought to be able to graduate from Harvard as he did. It's the first PhD from Harvard. But that talented 10th, or however you want to refer to them, there was a view that, okay, that those African Americans should be able to have full lives. But there was also a companion consensus with that, even among those people, that they still shouldn't expect, though, to be considered the exact same thing as white people. So even among the most benevolent minds of benevolent white Americans at the turn of the century, all over the country, there was a general consensus that perhaps it had been an error to assume that all black people could in fact become full-blown American citizens. It occurs to me that I might ought to pause there for just a second. And does everybody actually know what the premise of slavery by another name is? Should I actually explain that for a second? Maybe I will. But the premise of it is that that you have the Emancipation Proclamation, like we've been talking about. Slavery does become unconstitutional. The business systems and the economic systems of slavery do come to an end. And in fact, at the very beginning of all this, immediately after the Civil War, white Southerners across the board actually accept their defeat. There's some some exceptions to that. But slavery appears to have been brought to an end. And so for a minute, it's true that Abraham Lincoln, now in his death at that point, has ended American slavery. But it turns out that for many of the reasons that I've just been saying, that there was not the kind of consensus that would have been necessary to fully adhere to the real implications, the obvious implications of the Civil War. And because of that, the resolve to really end slavery didn't survive for very long. And so what the book's really about is how slavery comes back, and that there's this interlude in which the formerly enslaved African Americans in the South and the first generation of their descendants in the 1860s and 1870s, in varying ways, depending on exactly what geography we're talking about, because it's another thing about history that people lose track of, is that contradictory things can happen simultaneously in human life, but on the whole, across the South for a period of 20 to 25 years, the 4 million formerly enslaved people, Black Americans and the first children born of them after the Civil War, experienced some version of genuine liberty and genuine citizenship. And so it's in that period of time that part of the story we all know, but huge numbers of African American men vote, because only men can vote in that period. Not as many African Americans are elected to political office as the cliched version of events says, but large numbers of black men are elected to office, some very high office. And in fact, the Reconstruction era legislatures in the South are incredibly successful. In fact, it's those very much so contrary to the stereotypes and cliches, but it's those Southern legislators that have formerly enslaved men in them that are the first to pass laws that very clearly establish property rights for women. Those are the legislatures that passed the first laws that establish essentially the modern public education system that we have today, in the way that where the Southern and Western public education systems are organized very distinctly differently from Northeastern systems, which are still rooted in a kind of colonial practices from way back. But on a whole bunch of fronts, those legislatures with African American men in them are actually extraordinarily successful, groundbreaking in a lot of ways, which is sort of remarkable given the realities of the illiteracy and indigency and all of those issues. But so there is this period, this sort of heady time, in which black people are still incredibly poor, and they are living under very, very adverse circumstances, and they're surrounded by white people who are also incredibly poor. There are just as many absolutely, those 4 to 5 million desperately poor black people in the 1860s and 1870s are living amongst 4 or 5 million white people who are equally desperate and poor, but just then there's several million other white people who are not quite so desperate in the South. But then this system, these new forms of involuntary servitude begin to take root, and they're driven by capitalists and entrepreneurs in the South. In the beginning, it was people who had, before the Civil War, begun to experiment with what was the cutting edge of slavery. And because slavery has evolved in every society, and slavery was evolving in America before the Civil War. The belief had been that slavery worked as an agricultural system and would be largely limited to that, and that you couldn't use slavery in factories or industrial settings, that black people wouldn't be capable of that kind of work, or that there would be risks associated with them being involved in that kind of work. But of course, that's nonsense, of course, the notions behind that. But so in the 1850s, you had in Alabama, as it turned out, we don't think of Alabama as a cutting edge industrial geography, but in this period of time, it was in many respects. And so you had a number of very innovative, it's weird to use these positive sounding terms, but in terms of business thinking and systems evolutions. So you had these very wealthy, successful Southern capitalists who realized that, no, actually, I can put enslaved people into these factory settings, or I can work them in different ways, even in agricultural settings, where they, in fact, of course, are capable of tremendously advanced work. And so you ended up with this real irony of that during the Civil War, because Alabama had, Birmingham didn't yet exist at the time of the Civil War, but coal and iron ore had been discovered in Alabama, and there was a nascent industrial base there already. And so Alabama and Central Alabama and Richmond, Virginia were the two places in the South where there was significant industrial capacity for making iron and steel, and in particular the rolling mills necessary for making cannon. And by the beginning of the Civil War, you've begun to have large numbers of enslaved men working in those factories in Alabama. And as the war progresses, and as Richmond becomes more and more vulnerable to Union forces, the more and more of that munitions activity, the making of cannon, the making of rifle barrels, shifts to Alabama. And so the irony of irony is that by the time you get to the middle of the Civil War, almost all of the munitions being used by Confederate soldiers are being made by enslaved men back in Alabama and some in Richmond. And so this was incredibly successful. This industrialization of slavery before the Civil War proved itself to be very successful. The other thing that certain people in the South were learning in that period was that the old business model, the historic traditional business model, or the Virginia business model of slavery, of American slavery, that had been a kind of unchangeable pattern, could in fact be changed. And what that pattern was that you have to think of slavery as a business. Because it really was a business. We tend to think of it as an immoral act or as just an evil idea. And it was those things. But it also was a business. It was a business system. I compare it to the automotive industry, and in that when in a setting like this, oftentimes someone will raise with me, well, but wait a minute, isn't it the case that that only 1 in 10 Southerners own slaves? That's a very common sort of, the Civil War must not have been about slavery, or none of this connects to me. This is part of that argument. And of course, how many of us are actually, how many of us own cars? Well, that's probably a substantial number of us own cars, but how many of us own car making factories, or how many of us own car dealerships? There are all these elements of an economic system. And so in the same way that you have in the auto industry, you've got car makers, and you've got car repairers, and you've got car sellers, new car sellers, and used car sellers, and car wholesalers, and car deliverers, and you've got police who make cars behave the way that they're supposed to behave. You've got mechanics who make broken cars work better. All of those things you also had with slavery. You had thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were engaged in the business of slavery, who may or may not have ever actually owned, quote unquote, an enslaved person, or ever possessed control of an actual person. But you had slave acquirers and slave traffickers across the ocean. You had slave retailers and slave wholesalers and slave doctors and slave preachers, slave drivers. You had specialists in every possible form of the industry that slavery took on. And there were two ways that you made money with slavery. And one was the obvious, and that was to have people labor in the fields and then profit from the things that they grew in the fields, whatever that happened to be. And the other form of slavery, of profit in slavery, was the one we don't like to talk about, and that was breeding. And the breeding of slaves was a huge business. And so the economic model for slavery was that on a farm, was to have the right number of workers to have a very profitable agricultural operation, but you wanted to have men and women because you wanted them to, everybody's happier that way, and they're more likely to work hard, but also they procreate, have children, and that becomes as large a source of wealth as their actual labor. And so the necessities of that model, which had existed from the very beginning of the arrival of enslaved people in America, in some respects protected enslaved people. Because there were economic incentives that said, yeah, well, it makes sense actually, even though we know all about the terrible tearing apart of families, which did happen, but it also is the case that there were economic incentives to have men and women together and to have a certain amount of family conduct and opportunity among enslaved people. And it also was never in the economic interests of a slave owner to punish a slave to the point that they could no longer work or that they would die. I mean, there were huge investments that were made in enslaved people, and so the idea that you would whip them to death, was a bad idea. It was like whipping it was like getting mad at your car because it's not doing what it wanted to do, and so you set it on fire. That doesn't make any sense. And so the economic value, protected enslaved people in a certain perverse way, and also encouraged certain allowances that made life not quite as bad as it might have been. But in this last phase before the Civil War, all of that begins to be abandoned by certain commercial interests. And there's this recognition that no, actually, particularly in agriculture, in places like where I grew up in the Mississippi Delta, highly fertile, super productive land, that you could carve out a plantation in the wilderness there and then bring in enslaved men and not worry about having any women and not worry about how long anybody lived, basically. That the productivity of the land was so great that if you could work men to the very edge of human endurance, and you could punish them to such a degree that they would be compelled to work at a pace that was impossible to survive. But that if the production was great enough from all of that, you could pay for the cost of these enslaved people and make a reasonable return on that investment, and that was the terminology that was used. And so that if you worked men to death, as long as they survived 5 years or 6 years, then you would have made a profit on them. And if they survived 7 or 8 years, you would have made a substantial profit on them. And in that version of slavery, you didn't need to have any more women around than however many might be needed for the sorts of domestic activities that would have been traditional at the time. And so this much more aggressive, much more cruel kind of slavery was emerging just before the Civil War. And the people who were the architects of that were the architects after the Civil War of this news, because essentially they had seen how successful it was, and they came back around after the Civil War and wanted to reinstitute something as close to that as they possibly could. And so what was it that the 13th Amendment allowed them to do? What was the vehicle for that? Well, the vehicle for that was the criminal justice system. Was that if you could shift the purpose of the criminal justice system as it related to black people, who really hadn't been, the criminal justice system hadn't really been applicable to black people before the Civil War. Enslaved people were punished and governed by their owners, quote unquote, not so much by the courts. And so in the aftermath of the Civil War, you then begin to have very enterprising people pushing very hard to use this exception in the 13th Amendment to say, well, no, we can arrest larger and larger numbers of African American men. We can use this capacity to punish them with a form of slavery, and then end up recreating a system of involuntary servitude through that. And that's what happened. In the book's a much more detailed version of exactly where the scale that took on. But by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, it's hundreds of thousands of men who were being sucked into the system, and this also becomes the thing that there's been a tendency in the way that we look at our history and the history of abuses of African Americans. There's been a tendency to see tenant farmers and sharecroppers and the voting rights abuses and mob violence. There's a tendency to see all of those as related but separate things, as opposed to that they are actually all one thing. They're all facets of one thing, one system. And the threat of being returned to a de facto state of enslavement was the most terrible threat that existed in the lives of African American men. More so, I would venture, than the threat of lynchings or mob violence. Mob violence happened all too frequently, and every African American family in the first half of the 20th century had at least one story to tell about their connection to some terrible, terrible incident that had occurred. But every African American family had dozens and dozens of stories to tell about things much closer to the sort of labor exploitation that this book is about, and the threat of that any kind of encounter with the criminal justice system could lead to this absolutely catastrophic sequence of events. And that's why when I go out and talk about the book, very, very frequently, particularly when I'm in the South, at the end of the night, there'll be typically an elderly African-American woman will come up to me while I'm signing books or something and will say, now I understand, that night when my oldest brother came back from World War II, and he had been gone for 3 years, and we lived on this farm. My family lived on this farm in South Georgia, and I was only 9 years old, and my brother came back, or my uncle came back, and he showed up in the middle of the night, and my parents came in and woke me up and said, we have to go, and now's the only chance we have to go. And we all packed up, and we left in the middle of the night, and my brother and my uncle took us away. And I never really understood why, why we were running, in the middle of the night, and now I do. And that's what that was about, that because the laws of the South were reconfigured in a way, as a result of all this, where it essentially became a crime to be black. And now it's sort of a joke, the whole sort of, somebody calls 911 about, barbecuing while black, or, these sort of funny but, cringing lines about, that still go on today. But in this environment that we're talking about, it was a crime for a black man to speak loudly in the company of a white woman. It was a crime. It was a crime to walk beside a railroad line. It was a crime to sell the produce of your farm after dark. It was just this litany of crimes that were of statutes that were written to create crimes and create jeopardy, specifically so that it was almost impossible for a black man not to be in violation of the law at all times. It's not unlike the way that, not to overdraw the comparison, but it's not at all unlike the laws passed in Germany in 1936 to essentially make it a crime to be a Jew. Not by saying it's a crime to be a Jew, but to say this and this and this and this are illegal, and so all of these things which are endemic to Jewish life make you a criminal. And this is essentially the same thing with African Americans in the South. And so then what does that mean? That if you live in that kind of criminal jeopardy, that means that the message becomes very clear that I'm only safe if I live under the protection of someone else. And so that protection of someone else is going to be a substantial white landowner of some sort, someone who will come to my defense, and that's the only vulnerability, the only way that I can defeat this vulnerability. But the most insidious of all of those, the two most insidious of all those statutes were, one, that the old vagrancy statutes, and vagrancy statutes have existed forever and they exist today, but they go back to the Middle Ages. But in this period of time, all the southern states amplified both the vagrancy, the law that it was a crime if you were unemployed, which is what vagrancy statutes actually say. And so they amplified those statutes, and then they amplified the enforcement of them. And so if a black man at any time, when confronted by a police officer, or really by any white person, but a black man confronted as to did he have a job, could he prove that he had work? If he couldn't, then he'd committed a crime. He was vulnerable to prosecution for vagrancy. And once you were prosecuted for vagrancy, you might be fined $1 or $5 as your penalty. But along with that, in all of the southern states, there would be a series of fees attached, just as there are today. If you're fined by the courts for something, there are court fees that go along with that. But the fee system, as it was called then in the South, was such that, there was some version of this recently. I mean, it's amazing how bits of this still crop up today. And there was a judge in Pennsylvania in the last couple of years, a scandal about this sort of thing, but these exploitations of the court fee systems. But in Alabama, for instance, if you were convicted of vagrancy and fined $1 or $5, the fees that were attached to that, you were going to also have to pay fees. You had to pay a fee to the sheriff for arresting you, because sheriffs didn't receive any compensation for the job of being the sheriff. There was a schedule of fees that they could charge for everything that they did. So you paid something to the sheriff, you paid something to the deputy sheriff who actually picked you up, you paid the witnesses who testified against you if there was a trial, you paid the court clerk who handled the case. You didn't actually pay the judge, remarkably, but there was this whole series of fees that were attached, and so those fees that went along with the $1 fine or the $5 fine would typically end up at $150 or $200. And so, well, in 1905 or 1910, that's the equivalent of if a blue-collar worker today gets pulled over on the interstate for going 85 miles an hour, and and were to get a speeding ticket for that, and the fine for the ticket was $50,000 or $60,000. You know, that's the equivalent of what those fines were at the time. And so it was impossible for the vast majority of African Americans to even if these had been just legitimate things, it was impossible for them to pay those fines. And so if you couldn't pay the fines, you were sold into labor. And every county government, every county sheriff, and every state government in the South ended up with these huge contracts to sell prisoners, and that's the terminology that was used. You know, that talked about buying and selling convicts, and buying and selling prisoners. And it wasn't for life, and it didn't mean that if your children became slaves as well. And so that was the difference from the slavery before the Civil War. But it was the system by which thousands and thousands and thousands of men were sold back into slavery. And then once they went into those situations, there were no protections of any kind because they had no value. They had no economic value. And if someone died in the coal mine, or if someone starved to death, or they were crushed in an accident, then you just go and get another prisoner out of jail the next day at these incredibly low costs. And so that was the system. The other, and I'll stop shortly after this, the other most insidious law that was passed was it became a law in every southern state, it became the law that if you broke a contract, if you were a farm worker and you broke contract, of course the vast majority of black men at the beginning of the 20th century were farm workers in the South. And the way that the system worked in those days was that a man would sign a contract with a landowner to work for him for a season. And that was something that had been imposed by Union troops, actually, just after the Civil War. You know, there'd never been contracts of any sort, obviously, between black people and white people before the Civil War. And so as a way to try to organize labor relations after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, Union troops and generals had pushed this idea that there should be written contracts, even though the vast majority of African American men were illiterate at the time. But so they would sign these contracts that I'm going to work for you for one season. But then every southern state passed laws that said that if you didn't fulfill the contract, if you left that farm at some point during the season, that wasn't just a violation of the contract. It's just like anybody here, if we reach an agreement that if you're going to sell me a car and I agree to pay you 10 payments, every month, and I do half the payments and then I just stop paying you, well, we've got a conflict. You can sue me, come after me, you can get your car back, you can do any number of things, but you can't arrest me and have me put in jail, for not fulfilling my civil contract. Well, every southern state made it a crime if a farm worker didn't fulfill these contracts. And so if you were in the middle of the season and you were being starved, literally, and there were enormous numbers of these sorts of cases, and some of these things are really unpleasant to talk about, but they're the reality. But you're working for this white guy under circumstances where you and your family are starving, literally starving. Your wife is being raped routinely by the white man who owns the property. And the sexual exploitation of black women in this world was astonishingly rampant. I mean, it's maybe the single most unexamined, unacknowledged dimension of this whole part of our history still today. But the degree to which that white men in the South, landowning white men in the South, deep into the 20th century, still held to the view that black women connected to the property that they controlled were within their reach for whatever sexual purposes they wanted was an absolutely constant idea across the South, even into the 20th century. So you could be working with this man who's raping, or his sons are raping your wife routinely, and you're starving to death, and you're being whipped in the field because the lash was in an endemic element of the Southern landscape well into the 20th century. W. D. Boyce, before he wrote The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, one of the chapters of that book is called The New Egypt. And he's describing a trip he makes across South Georgia and what he's seeing as he's crossing Georgia. And one of the things he describes is just that everywhere he goes, at all times, there are long lines of black men in the fields chained together being whipped by overseers, in the 20th century. And so you're in those circumstances being routinely whipped, terrible things happening to members of your family, and another white guy comes along and says, hey, you're a good guy and you're a good worker. Why don't you come over to my place and I'll treat you a lot better than this? And if you say yes, and you go with the guy, then you've committed a crime in the South in that period of time. And very high probability that if you leave the place, that the sheriff is going to come the next day or a week later and find you in the other place and bring you back. And now you'll be working for the first guy, but in chains and as a convict laborer. And so those kinds of cases. There are tens of thousands of them. The records of those cases that still survive are just tens of thousands of them all across the South. And so this was the system that had re-emerged in the South by the beginning of the 20th century. And all of it, this kind of diabolical, dystopian, parallel universe, when you just try to imagine what America, or at least what a lot of people in our country imagined was happening at the end of the Civil War, at the end of this incredible carnage and sacrifice. If you imagine, even Frederick Douglass said it. Frederick Douglass wrote about these exact things in the last years of his life. But if this place that our country appears to be going, having just gone through this experience, which is, as I said, really unprecedented in human history, that what had just occurred, the emancipation of this group of people who are visually and physically identifiably different, and the idea that you liberate this enslaved group of people and declare them to be the equal of those who control the society. I mean, this thing that just had nothing like it had ever happened before in the way that it did, and the vision of what America was supposed to be on its way to at that point, and at the point that the 13th Amendment is drafted and adopted, and then you leap ahead 50 years further to the world that in fact came to pass, and that whole terrifying, parallel, perverse existence slipped through that one set of 7 or 8 words in the middle of the 13th Amendment. So pay attention to the small print. I'll stop there, and if we've got time, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Sure. Yes, ma'am.
One bit of news that I haven't heard as broad. News from the recent elections has been trickling around things that have happened here and there. Colorado just voted to remove that accept as punishment for slavery clause from its constitution. There were a few mentions of attempts at other times and places. Do you see any sort of that getting further traction?
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know. Of course, I'm writing a book now with Eric Holder. We're co-authoring a book that will come out next year, hopefully. If he'll stop running for president, that would help. Called Pursuing Justice, that's about sort of the evolution of how our definition of justice has changed and who it applied to over time. But one of the things about these issues around mass incarceration and work in prison, and it is true that because of that provision of the 13th Amendment, in fact, slavery does still exist today, and as it's defined in the 13th Amendment, it does exist and it's legal if it is punishment for a crime. Now, there's a kind of arcane Jesuitical debate that I at one point was going to go into a little bit, but I decided not to, about the difference between slavery and involuntary servitude, and whether that provision, which is it referring to? What's the antecedent to the end of the clause and all that? But all of this boils down to that even at a time when people are talking about mass incarceration and that we intellectually acknowledge, probably everybody in this room agrees with some version of that, mass incarceration has gone too far, it's terrible that America, that 25% of all the prisoners in the world are imprisoned by America. And probably everybody in this room agrees. We would have some disagreements, but everybody probably agrees that's a bad thing. And it's bad that it seems to be disproportionately African Americans, and it's bad that the black people go to prison longer for drug crimes that are similar to drug crimes that white people. We would all agree on the basics of all that. Also, pretty much everybody in this room, unless you're really, and I'm sure there are some, unless you're like just a saint, everybody in this room really doesn't care about prisoners. We really don't care very much about prisoners, and we really don't want to have to think very hard about it. If there's some, and we basically, and one reason we feel that way is because, unlike this story I tell here, because the, absolute assertion, and I believe proven, of this story is that these terrible things were happening not just to bad people who'd done bad things, but to an equal number, if not greater number of people who'd done nothing, who were completely innocent. At least today, we have a draconian criminal justice system, and there are way too many people who are in the system who've been convicted of crimes that they didn't commit, and that actually is a very substantial number today. But it's nothing like what I write about here. And so we have this problem of that, in theory, we don't like the way things have turned out. But if you then say, okay, let's, whatever the nearest Pennsylvania State Corrections facility is to where we're standing right now, if we say, okay, let's just let everybody out tomorrow because this system has, hasn't worked right and has been unjust, well, probably everybody would be a little uncomfortable with that too, And that's the problem, is that we like it as an intangible, a sort of notion of justice that we think ought to exist, but we don't like the reality of it. And President Obama and Holder and Sally Yates was point person on this, ran into this problem when they set out they accomplished really dramatic, reforms in terms of the federal prison system, and there at the end, they had hoped for a grand bargain around criminal justice with the Republicans, and even more dramatic things than, like everything else, that was obstructed. But there at the end, President Obama, did like 35,000 commutations of the sentences of federal prisoners, and people don't know this, but came very close to, at one point, to issuing an order that would have commuted the sentences of every federal death row prisoner who was on death row at the time. Came very, very close to doing that. But even there, and it was Sally Yates's job as Deputy Attorney General then. She was actually the person who, in this sort of frantic process in the last year of the Obama administration, she was the person who she was the final pair of eyes on every one of the folders over, are we going to let this guy out? Are we going to commute this life sentence to something else? And she was the last set of eyes on these. And the other people were involved in this process, and there was only a handful of DOJ workers who could be involved in this because of restrictions that the Republican Congress had put on how many people, because they wanted to muck up the whole process. But so these things were passing through, and everybody, and there were, thousands and thousands of these prisoners who met the empirical standard that had been set, that they've served at least half of their sentence, they weren't involved in a violent act, but it's a set of definable variables. And so you had these thousands of prisoners who had been cleared that they should qualify for the possibility of this early release. And then it was Sally's job to be the one that gave them all this final look before they went to the president to actually, in this hope to avoid a Willie Horton situation, but where you release somebody and then they go commit a terrible act. And she would take 100 or 200 of those files to her apartment every weekend, and that's what she would do all week, was going through those things. And over again, what she would come up with is that here are these two people who, by one way of looking at it, they're identical. Similar crime, they've served half their time, they haven't done more bad things in prison. Oh, but this guy beat his girlfriend up over and over again, 20 years ago. He wasn't ever convicted of that, but it's in the record. Or there was this other, or this guy had this other thing, and so over and over again, it became that, in theory, both of these guys we want out, but do we really want this guy out? And what that all goes back to is that that is a central problem to our whole criminal justice debate now, and that is that from the very beginning of time, in which men and women are able to speak in some sort of language to one another, from the very beginning of human history, one of the first things that small groups of human beings did was to designate a few people to stand watch on the perimeter, and the sort of the bigger specimens, to sort of, and there was a social agreement that we realized that you're going to have to do things that that the rest of us don't want to do, that they're the other bad. When the Neanderthals come around, you're gonna beat them up before they come in here and take what we caught yesterday, and we're okay with that, and I don't want to have to be the one to go, beat a Neanderthal to death. So you beat the Neanderthal to death for us, and it's going to be okay. And we trust you. We trust you to use your discretion on the boundaries, and that's been our deal, with law enforcement and the guys on the perimeter through all of human history. But we're now in an era where those events are occurring, the things that used to be out on the perimeter are occurring right in front of us because we all have a camera in our pocket, and so now that has amplified our uneasiness about what it is we really want. We both want we want a system that gives us a real sense of security that all manner of bad guys are going to be we're going to be protected from them, but then we don't like the consequences of that system and we get stuck. So, but I do think that things like what happened in Colorado are good, and even more so in Florida, the most incoherent election in all of American history, the outcomes that we've been hearing about, but also in the same election overwhelmingly restoring the voting rights of felons, thereby ensuring that an outcome in the other races, almost certainly can never happen again. But it's bizarre but those are good things. Those are good things. Overly long answer. Yes, ma'am.
The phrase criminal justice in so many instances is an oxymoron because there's no justice. But I'm thinking about here in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner is dealing with the issue of the injustice of bail.
Oh, yeah.
Again, I think affecting the African American community much more so because it's an economic issue.
Yeah.
What do you see as any kind of a resolution?
Well, there's all of these things, and bail now is and it's not just here; it's also in New York, all sorts of activity there, and bail maybe being eliminated from the system, and but all kinds of people out of Rikers Island. I'm sure it's the same story here, but at Rikers Island, who are there for a year or 2 years because they can't make bail on these relatively minor things, and then by the time those 2 years are over, this 17-year-old that you brought in, who was still a 17-year-old who had a chance of being a productive citizen, doesn't have much chance of that anymore when he comes out of Rikers as a 19 or 20-year-old. And examples of that all around the country in that issue. But with all of these things that are all facets of this bigger problem of that we have a criminal justice system. This thing that is called the criminal justice system has been a system of justice for white people historically, and it was very important through all of the history of our courts and the way that our government was designed. It was always very important that the rights of white people, as they were understood at any particular point in time, be preserved and safeguarded through that system. That's what justice meant. But for black people, it's been a system of injustice, a system of designed injustice all along. It's not exactly that anymore. It's the intentionality of its injustice is not as obvious anymore, but the system we live with today is, it's born of that. It's born of these really two separate systems. And so I say oftentimes about this, Holder doesn't really agree with me since he's former Attorney General, but I talk about our justice system the way that Republicans used to talk about the Affordable Care Act, that there is no fixing it, it has to be pulled out of the ground by the roots. And I'm afraid that really is the case. But the other perverse thing that's happening, and maybe there's something sort of optimistic about it too, is that there is some movement toward meaningful change. President Trump today announced a sentencing reform and a sort of justice reform thing that maybe is the first thing that even in any fashion has any sensibility to it in the past 2 years. But one of the reasons for that while Americans still don't, we really deep down don't really care very much about prisoners and people who've broken the law, but the push for fairness, where we had this system that was so grossly inequitable between how it treated whites and blacks. And so through the courts and through politics and other ways, we've now had this push and push and push for more equity in the justice system. And so the response to that, though, has been not to make the system more equitable in terms of punishment, matching crimes and such. It's been to make the system more fair. And what that means has been to take this incredibly draconian system, draconian in its treatment of black people, and to begin treating white people in a more draconian fashion. And so the simplest version of that, even though it's still a great disparity, but the simplest version of that is that when my son was 17 and 18 years old in high school, and if he and his buddies got into some sort of trouble that, where it wasn't that long ago that the cops would deliver them back home, back to my house and tell me about it and say, hey, I need to do something about it. But his black peers from the same high school doing the same things, we're going to end up going to jail. Well, now we have a system in which the white kids go to jail too. Not with the same frequency, but we've extended this ridiculously draconian system to more people. And so now, for the first time, you have middle-class whites and other people saying, "Hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. This is a good kid," or it's just like the way that we now with the opioid epidemic. We talk about it, we call it an epidemic. Did anybody ever talk about the crack epidemic exactly? No. We talked about this crime wave and so now, in a weird sort of way, now that the big addiction and related criminality issue of the day is something that is predominantly a white issue, poor white issue, poorer and lower middle class white issue. Then suddenly we have some openness to the idea that medical health responses to these things make sense, and maybe that's what would have made sense in the 80s with regard to crack too. But no, we viewed it that everybody should go to prison and maybe crack mothers should be executed. I was thinking that. So I think though there is some progress, it's a kind of cynical progress, but these are things that really matter. And I'll end with this. Sometimes I'm asked the question. Usually by students or something, but I'll get a question in a setting like this where someone will say, well, so, this book that you wrote is about these things that, you didn't know about till you started digging into it and none of us knew about, and, you look back on it and we realize how terrible these things were and how weird it is that people didn't realize at the time how bad it was. They were blind to how terrible a thing they were doing. And then the student will say, well, so 50 years from now or 100 years from now, when whoever they are looking back at us, what are they gonna point at? As the great failure, the great on our part at this time. And when I first started getting that question, this is a good thing. My first response would always be, well, one thing was going to be the way that we treat gay people. The way that this society has treated gay people. And it's amazing that now it's just 10 years later, and that answer is different. It's just incredible, really, how much that has changed. But the other one that hasn't changed is this criminal justice, and this idea that there are thousands of people, and I won't go through the calculations, but it's just an empirical fact. There are thousands of people in prison today who didn't commit the crime that they're convicted, that they're there for. Now, many of them may have lived messed up lives. There may have been a reason why the police the guys on the perimeter kind of were going after them, but there are thousands of people in prison today who didn't do the things that they were convicted of. There are, at a minimum, hundreds of people serving life sentences and waiting for execution who didn't commit the capital offense that they were convicted of. We've just through DNA, we're up to about 350 death row inmates have been exonerated through DNA testing, and that gives us a sense of relief, but the problem is that there's only DNA evidence in about 25% of all of those cases. So the vast majority of people in death row are there on the basis of eyewitness identifications that are highly unreliable and all kinds of circumstantial things. And there is no possible way that they'll ever be exonerated by DNA, because there is no DNA evidence, And so you have the system that is a legacy of a time that doesn't represent us, that we're better than. But because it's uncomfortable and complicated and expensive, we refuse to untangle it. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when our grandchildren, great-grandchildren looking back, and the idea that we were still executing people who we couldn't be absolutely sure they'd even done the crime, those kinds of things. That will be that will be the one thing, that'll be the basis on which those future Americans, future citizens of Earth, may well decide that America, was not the moral clarion society of its time, that it was special in a lot of ways, but that may be the one absolute proof that, oh, actually, that was a deeply flawed. That may be the same way we look at the Aztecs, and we say, wow, that was an amazing society, but that human sacrifice part, was really problematic, Well, this is, we may live through all the future ages, assuming we get to have them with that dark spot. Thank you.